So my main background is law, as has been mentioned, and laws are important in shaping the trajectory of clinical research, clinical trials, and also incidentally in the funding that goes into them, because as been mentioned, the way that funding flows is often curtailed by regulations or by the compensation that people hope to get from investing in this field. Traditionally, the regulators have been identified as the enemy of the anti-aging movement, by the FDA being too difficult to get to agree that certain products are safe and effective. And there's something to be said about streamlining regulatory pathways, making it less onerous and more efficient to bring products to market. But we are also reminded of the legacy of snake oil that has been associated with our field, and therefore having some agency to check that trials research is indeed rigorous and that it is cost effective to administer these treatments, it might not be a bad thing. I'll stop there. Maybe there's a discussion with the panel and you guys as well.
Yeah, I'm actually interested in aging for a very long time, but I did not imagine, say, 20 years ago that I would now be involved in designing clinical trials. But I think this must be done to have good data, and it must, of course, be done also in a way begin with the end in mind. So, on one hand, of course, you want to have safe trials, but you also want to have a good effect size, meaning you want to see a result in the end, a difference between the treatment group and the control group. That's actually the only issue I really have with Didier's approach as he presented it. When you're comparing the ones with the currently best treatment to the ones with the best treatment plus some novel treatment, you will probably not see so much of a difference. It's probably better to have an effect size difference if you compare a novel treatment with kind of standard control group of people who are not treated in a specific way. Yeah, myself, there are actually 3 trials that I'm interested in. One is pretty conventional. We are testing antifibrotic. We will be doing this in rabbit in the preclinical trial in the next years, and if we are successful there, it will be tested in a human study, maybe in 3 or 4 years. That's very specific for eye surgery. Then I'm interested in, and that's actually a grant application that was submitted a few weeks ago, where we are going for diseased people who have cancer or have stroke, and we are looking at biomarkers to find out in the end whether they may respond to some xenotherapy. But that's not the issue in the first part of this trial. There we are just looking for the biomarkers. But the biomarkers are important in 2 ways. They are not just important to measure outcome, but I think they should also be used, if possible, to select the right patients. So this is the idea of an enriched clinical trial. You only want to have those patients in there who could potentially profit from the treatment. And that's now done for many clinical trials by industry, and I think also for xenotherapy and for other treatments, you want to have biomarkers to first select the right patients. And then in the next step, you need other different biomarkers to measure the outcome. And this should be function, but maybe you can also use molecular markers there. And for the precision xenotherapy, we will probably be going for molecular markers. And this will be an exploratory study, and then we hope we have the possibility to then do a xenotherapy study with the right patients selected based on biomarkers. Yeah, the third study I'm trying to push is actually kind of treating healthy people with natural compounds like fish oil versus maybe fisetin. And there, the idea is also to have biomarkers first, and then you have 2 groups. One group where the assignment is based on the biomarkers, and another group where it's randomly done. Assignment meaning we use biomarkers, or we want to use biomarkers to select, for example, fish oil versus fisetin versus both versus no intervention. And then in the other group, we will not do this kind of intelligence. And then we hope to have a difference between those two groups. So that would be demonstrating that you can do this precision medicine, this personalized medicine kind of thing also for prevention.
And how old are the people in those groups?
Right now we are thinking to at least we take healthy people, but then at an older age to have a signal that is large. So maybe 60 to 70 years old, year-olds who are still pretty healthy. Okay, I keep it at that.
So I understand that I should rather talk about the field rather than what I do myself. So it seems to me that the biology of aging sphere has the right solutions for the current needs for aging populations. It's something completely new. But surprisingly, the biology of aging field, or not surprisingly, depending on if you know how it works, has been until recently very far apart from the clinical developments. So for example, we have seen nematodes live 10 times longer. We have seen mice and even lemurs recently live 50% longer. So lemurs, it's primates. Instead of living 6 years, they live 10 years with some new developments. But of course, we don't see that in the humans. And if we were treated animals like we treat ourselves, we wouldn't do such results. So the solutions are there, but they are accumulating without much results for us because there is this lack of communication. In fact, on the clinical side, we don't talk about aging, we talk about disease. And so you have disease specialists for Alzheimer, Parkinson's, etc. And they don't use the right tools because the tools are mostly from the troubles we had 100 years ago when we were fighting microbes. But today we are fighting our own body and how it degenerates with time. And so I think this translation that we are having right now with the clinical developments of longevity are very new and very important.
I'm Guilhem. First, I'm happy to be here, but it's very strange that I'm into a clinical trial panel because all my life I try to avoid clinical trial in all the company I create. As you know, I'm a former researcher, as some of you know, who create company coming from my labs. Every year we create new companies. And we have still one company who start a clinical trial this year. And it was so much a nightmare that I decided that I will not become the CEO of the company. So first advice, if you don't like crazy regulation, don't run a company that do clinical trial. Really, listen yourself. Avoid it. The second thing is because we spoke about that we have a lack of money to fund research and clinical trial. When you are in France, I have to say it, for example, this clinical trial have been funded by the French government. Not like venture capital is just a grant, 15 million euros given by the French government to enable us to do it. And I always say that France is the best place to create a research companies, at least for funding. Quite hard sometimes to find entrepreneurs, but we can find them sometime. The second thing is that most of my other company, if you were at my previous presentation, do organ on chip, human on chip. Meaning that we try to, using human cell, to reproduce the most closest human organ on little chip to test drug on it. And in fact, the main point to do that is to avoid clinical trial. Alors, of course, you cannot get approved drugs with that because we have no notified body. I don't remember when I discussed yesterday with you. But the point for the moment, for example, me and my friend, we take drugs. And most of those drugs come from study done on mouse. And you know, we are not so secure about it. I would prefer, and for example, this parish, I think, would prefer too, that before taking a drug for ourselves, to try on a little version of ourselves, on little version on our organ, and to see that, oh yes, it's good for my liver. Oh shit, my brain starts to die. So things like that. So most of the time, I suggest, when it's possible, of course, then after you cannot do money with it because you cannot get the refund reimbursement from the social security. But to have some tools like organ on chip, human on chip, advanced cell culture to avoid these crazy clinical trials.
Okay, thank you. One question to the legal specialist is, what is, in your opinion, the best country or the best countries at the moment, let's say, with a good research system where you could have clinical test? And maybe complementary question is, what is absolutely necessary to change, and is there a place where you could change, I would say, something like only one or two things, and then you would have a good system? A question to you, George, is more, can you say a little bit more about what are in your, and maybe Edouard, you can also answer this, what would be, if we had a clinical trials on longevity, but also to detect senescence, what would be the best biomarkers or the best things that we could use to know, let's say, that the health of the person is in degradation before they die, so you have more results fast. And then maybe for you, Guilhem, so you say, okay, human on a chip, and is it for which kind of things is it already quite reliable, and for which kind of things is it not enough reliable in your opinion? Because, for example, okay, concerning the biggest problem at the moment concerning longevity and concerning, let's say, senescence is neurodegenerative diseases, and I suppose that a brain on a chip you don't have, but maybe you have something like that. Yeah, okay, that's for the questions. And so also, if you especially agree or disagree with each other, it's the moment to say it politely or not, but maybe politely.
So whether I agree or disagree, obviously I agree that the best country to do research or to at least start a company must be France. But I think I disagree with him on other things, namely whether clinical trials are that horrible and ought to be avoided. And depending on your position on that, you might want to choose one or another country. It depends on whether you have a marketing strategy that targets a particular population, and that would normally drive also where you select to do your clinical trial. You want to partner with the clinicians who see these patients. Now, if you're saying, I'm not seeing any patients, Caliban, I want to do an anti-aging trial on healthy people, then you might choose your circumstances differently. Japan has been highlighted in the regenerative medicine field as doing progressive things about conditional approvals. So that is, in a clinical trial, you have to demonstrate that something is safe and effective. And after you've done that, you then have to negotiate with the payers as to who will actually use these drugs or these treatments. And Japan is trying to expedite that for certain types of therapies where you only have to demonstrate safety and efficacy comes out in the wash while you are negotiating with the payers in the healthcare system. So Japan has been a destination of choice. If you're more radical-minded, fellow travelers like Peter Thiel have suggested that we should offshore clinical trials to jurisdictions where oversight is minimal. Liz Parrish has done that with her company. But again, it comes back to why you want to do that. If you want to make sure that something is robustly looked at by an independent entity, it might serve you well to do that through an established route with the expertise at hand.
Yeah, essentially I agree with what you said. So the question for me was about best biomarkers, and I think, well, first of all, for health, so to say aging, and then for senescence, I think what you definitely want is some functional markers, like you also mentioned them, and it could be grip strength. So there are some panels, and I think Andrea would be much more competent talking about such panels. And then maybe on the molecular macroscopic level, there could be senescence markers like beta-galactosidase, but this is again much more difficult. They are specific also for working for specific tissues. Like she said, it's not so much working on blood. And what I would, of course, be interested, but you need an exploration for that, is gene and protein expression or metabolism. So molecular markers are also a possibility, but they are not so many that are really validated. So you have to be very careful on that. And of course, a biomarker should also depend on the intervention you are applying. I think it is, if you want to see an effect, you probably want to also know how may the intervention work, and which is the established or semi-established aging biomarker that you expect the most likely to be modified by that intervention.
So I think the question on biomarkers very much depends on whether you are trying to fit in the existing system. So for example, if you want to do clinical development against Alzheimer's, even though you believe you have a drug that has a lot of potential with many diseases, then you will focus on typical Alzheimer's endpoints, right? If now your question is trying to target a clinical trial that will demonstrate that it's good for everyone above 65-year-old, with some exceptions, then it requires indeed something that we don't have today. And as we discussed, it could be defined with some biomarkers, but that, as Andrea Meyer was saying, need to be very functional, like your ability to walk on a line without falling, or stand on one foot without falling, your grip strength, your forced expiratory volume. That's a very good marker for mortality. Things that can be tested rapidly. And we could imagine some tests. So here I would imagine some microfluidic tests, typically, where you have one drop of blood and you measure lots of things at the same time, very cheap. That could be an intermediate solution. And regarding approaches, what I see, and I think I'm not the only one in the field, is that one of the secrets of the biology of aging field is prevention, preventive medicine. So it can be indeed food, diet, and exercise, but it can be also molecules or interventions to perhaps regrow the thymus or whatever. But preventively, rather than waiting to be very sick to give a very heavy dose of treatment, and it's much more difficult. And I think here the trouble is that we don't know if the payers are going to reimburse, and so we don't find the investors for the clinical trials that are long, because it's prevention. You're not starting with sick people, you're waiting to see if they are becoming sick. And here, I think Singapore is probably the best place. In Singapore, the government already gives goodies to the general population when they walk enough every day. And people know it, and they use it to buy shoes or whatever at the end of the month. And they seem to be very enthusiastic about these preventive measures. In the European sphere, a lot of people talk about preventing rather than curing, especially for cancer. But I don't see yet the measures, the incentives to make this economically interesting for investors.
Thanks. First, I will start by the fact that it was an exaggeration. Of course, in some cases, we need clinical trial. Just me, I don't want to do it. I think that, let's say that when there is too much regulation, there is some guys, and particularly researchers, most of the time we cannot invest millions of euros on one shot, and so it's nice to have some bypass. So that's the first point. But for people having a big plan and a lot of money, clinical trial are the best way, because at the end you have approved drugs. regarding human on chip and organ on chip, it's a very quite new field. Meaning, I think since we heard about since 5 years, the most, let's say, the most famous company in this field is Emulate from the Weiss Institute in Boston, always American, of course. And let's say that for the moment they try to be included in preclinical trial to make their system approved by the FDA. And there is gut on chip, brain on chip, lung on chip, blood-brain barrier. You have a lot of labs all over the world trying their own technologies. For example, I think they were Estonian and Serbian guys. They want to try new drugs against Alzheimer. And so they told me, okay, let's have a research project together where Guilhem, you will put on a chip a gut, because it was some oral drugs, and then after a blood-brain barrier, because there is a barrier between your blood and your brain, and then after a brain on chip. So for the moment, it's absolutely out of regulation. It's just a good way for most of the researchers who not necessarily even have the time or the accreditation to work on mouse and even less on human, just to say, okay, I have an idea, I have 10,000 drugs to test, and let's test this in my lab and see if it works on really human cell. And when I say human cell, it's not because we already know that we can cultivate human cell just in a petri dish, but as close as possible from in vivo condition. And here is the tricks. In most of the proposal we have, the big game for each human on chip or multi-organ on chip is 3 steps. First, to show that approved drugs in the past are pass the human on chip test, and then that a drug that had been rejected in phase 3 don't pass the human on chip test, and then a drug that passed the phase 3 and finally some years after, finally we discover that it kills everybody, ideally should be so also in the human on chip test. And if we have that, of course we will never go, I will never go to get FDA approval or thing like that, because I hate administration, you know. I'm an entrepreneur, that is why I quit public research, but I think some people will do it. And so for the moment, human on chip, organ on chip, is just a way for researchers just to try their idea as many as they can without needing of money and regulation. And after, when it works, I'm sure someone will want to do money on it, will say, hey, you have a nice molecule, I will do a clinical trial. Probably someone else.
If I may come back to that. So yes, if you've got something that reduces the enormous cost of clinical trials, people will put a lot of money towards that. So rest assured. People were interested in what advocacy can do, etc. Following the 21st Century Cures Act, the FDA is currently consulting on surrogate endpoints for clinical trials that have been mentioned here. We need for aging. So they've got a list of surrogate endpoints, and they are inviting people to comment on that list, including their 4th point in what they're inviting comments on is whether there are any assays or considerations that should be included in that list. And for example, the TAME trial methodology is not even on that list, but you could, as a community, come up with lab-on-chip approaches or whatever that are good aging markers, and then slowly convince the FDA to put that on the list. In terms of what Edouard said in prevention, I think that's a challenge. Because what people like me have been doing in our lobbying work is trying to expedite routes to markets for life-saving drugs. And we've been fairly successful in the last 10 years about getting things that really save lives quickly to market. But that comes at the cost of the effective but very ponderous, kind of hard blood pressure drugs, those kind of blockbuster drugs, but which take a long time to actually show any kind of benefit. So if your aging therapy is something like that, it doesn't have a life-saving effect immediately that you can demonstrate, but maybe ameliorates a biomarker that might play out well in 20 years' time, there really is a challenge with that in how you bring that to market with the right funding conditions, because that's not where regulators are responsive. That's where they're very tricky, and they will be very curious whether you can back up your results before you get to market.
Okay, yeah. You can.
Just in 1 minute, since I'm here, something very useful, so I start a call about that, is if one of you have a lab in Europe, we want to find some new biomarker about aging, because we have this problem, which is we can do cell culture and everything, but we don't know what means, for example, a brain-on-chip aging. And we would like to find all the cellular and molecular biomarker for all the organs to be able to know if our human-on-chip age or not. And for the moment, we get the publication from Belsky, for example. He took the Dunedin study and he showed, for example, that telomeres do not correlate at all with aging. The epigenetic clock correlates well, but there is a statistical bias anyway. So if one of you want to do this kind of study, we can apply for H2020 together and do the job. I can provide the human-on-chip, and you provide with your brains the ability to find all these cellular and molecular biomarker. And then after we publish, and everybody can play. It was just a call.
Also to go along Guilhem, it's not only about clinical trials, there are also nutraceuticals. Then you need clinical trials, but it's less complex than developing drugs. So if you do have solid evidence for nutraceuticals, it's a faster path. And also for the cost, increasingly the regulator is interested in having clinical trials at home rather than at hospital. And this is a much cheap, well, not cheap, but less expensive. And it's better for the patients because they don't have to stay at the hospital for when they are taken in charge. So there are all sorts of things happening, but it doesn't change the whole problem or the whole difficulties of getting through these steps, which are needed if you want to make really the point and be safe, very safe.
Okay. Well, to be honest, I'm a little bit, let's say, I was hoping a little bit more things concrete concerning possible clinical trials who could be started. Or maybe then last question to the four of you, but more the three of you, I think, who are following that more, is at the moment concerning what's going on and also concerning the project, what is for you the best clinical trial really going on concerning aging? Can you explain, one of you, why is this famous first clinical trials on metformin still not going on? And do you know what's, so Jim Falloon is one guy promoting tests in the US. He wants to organize it, but it's not coming. So what do you think about that, and what do you think we longevists could do to push?
So I was asked about the TAME trial yesterday, so I looked it up. And it's the same issue as in the last stop. They just don't have the funding, which goes to show that it's nice and well to take an off-patent, off-label drug and repurpose it for aging, but nobody's interested in funding that. So you can make a lot of hype about that, but if you don't have your guns lined up to actually then drive the trial forward, I don't know what the
But I mean, in theory, public institutions should be especially interested because it doesn't cost nothing and it's for the public health.
Oh yes, it costs millions, 25 million, I believe.
No, well, the results, if these drugs are working, they will give better health to the population and they will cost almost nothing. Metformin cost almost nothing. Yeah,
but lots of things do. So better nutrition, etc. It's a perennial case that prevention is better than cure, and that it would be so much more effective, and every pound or dollar, euro put into a preventive program saves the the taxpayer 10 or 20 or 100, and everyone who's in that field makes that argument, and it's still the world is the way it is. You had another question about that.
I'm trying to remember the question. I had a.
What's going on really?
Okay, yes.
The best,
no, I think that typically the ongoing clinical trials with spermidine by Guido Kremer are interesting because these spermidine is something that generates autophagy in the body. It extends the lifespan of mice, for example. And there are several ongoing clinical trials, some with first good results, not on aging per se, but on the different pathologies of aging, really very much related to aging. And this seems to be something very interesting. We have, of course, also the ongoing senolytics advances. So I don't know where it is in terms of clinical trials, but they have raised enough funding to do the clinical trials they need. Yes.
They've done, so if we're talking Unity, they've done 3 phase 1 trials and is imminently starting a phase 2.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time for the audience to ask questions. We have time, at least for quite a few questions. So 1, 2, 3.
So I think we all agree clinical trials are far too expensive. That has serious consequences. Many drugs never even get a chance to be tested because it's simply too expensive. My opinion is that the cost of clinical trials can be lowered by at least an order of magnitude, probably more, by doing a few simple things. To do that, you have to know where is the cost of clinical trials. One is the clinicians. Some clinicians charge tens of thousands of euros to contribute one patient to a clinical trial. There is no need for that, especially in countries where the clinicians are already paid by the government and hospitals are financed by the government. Second cost is the companies pay for each patient that is in a clinical trial. They pay for all the healthcare cost of that patient. There's no need for that because these patients in countries where healthcare is funded publicly, their care is already paid for. So the only cost that should be paid for in the clinical trial is the extra cost that's attributed directly to the clinical trial, not all the other regular healthcare that should be going on. So they should be conducted in systems where basically the hospitals already pay via the public funding for the regular healthcare, and only the addition should be charged. The third thing is all this administration. We now use humans, like clinical trial nurses and biostatisticians to do all of this stuff. There's no need for that. You can give people ways to be automatically recognized, like with biometric markers or with chips. There are lots of devices where you can automatically enter data or that record data automatically. They're properly validated. So a lot of the cost of just collecting the data, going through the data, analyzing them, can be completely cut out. So if you do all of these things, you'll see that all of a sudden the cost of clinical trial will come down by, as I said, a factor of 10 to 100, which will mean that it will become much more easy to test a few things. Then it has already been mentioned, innovative designs like bringing things to market before efficacy has been demonstrated so you can get real-world evidence. These also will help to reduce the cost.
Yeah, actually what you mentioned last, I think it's the most important point, the high failure rate. So definitely want to work on that and try to predict the outcome of clinical trials based on preclinical data, for example. And this is some work where you can also do data analysis. And I think this is something that by machine learning has a good chance.
So I see a clinical trial a week in the UK, in continental Europe, in Eastern Europe, and some in the US, occasionally in Africa. And once in a blue moon, there is a physician-related payment that's not warranted by the hospital. I've never seen a phase 2 or 3 trial where the sponsor paid for all of the healthcare costs. I've never seen that. Obviously, phase 1 is different. And yeah, obviously we see different trials. Yeah, obviously our experience is very different. But I just see different trials in you. And yes, it'd be wonderful if we could abolish the biostatisticians or maybe have quicker ways of capturing the data. But that cost pressure is very effective. You know, if a sponsor has a way of minimizing their cost, I'm sure they're exploring that, and I see them explore it. Sometimes it's just cheaper to have an old analog record than an efficient digital one.
Well, actually, the prices of clinical trials are very different depending on how you do them. So typically, if you do a multi-center trial between Russia, Serbia, and Switzerland, where you do it mostly at home rather than at hospital, you can probably divide by 10 or more the price compared to standards used by the pharmaceutical industry.
We all know that clinical trials are an expensive thing, and we know that this is one of the reasons why we do not see all the potential geroprotectors tested and the geroprotectives lifestyle measures tested and so on and so forth. But there is a side way, which is patient-organized clinical trials, and my question will be how the community and, for instance, open longevity projects could collaborate with the existing biotechnology startups, biotechnology companies, and even supplement companies in order to streamline this process?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that is something that is really changing. We have the tools now to monitor or self-monitor more effectively. So where in the past volunteer-driven trials basically couldn't happen because the technology wasn't there, that's changing now. And making those synergies happen, especially in the nutraceutical space, is very promising, because we've seen small community initiatives where everyone, takes aspirin for a week and then they all get a blood test or whatever. So just as an example, I think there's great potential there. That's different from if you're asking for funding, and what everyone, including Aubrey, said, there's currently a little bit of froth in the sector about millions pouring into funding research. Nobody will fund that kind of research, except people themselves. Let's distinguish first between clinical trial and community initiatives. So a clinical trial of an investigational medicinal product is something that hasn't been used for that indication before, and it's not in the market. That's different. You will need a sponsor who writes a summary of product characteristics, and it's all very involved. And then GCP is just a minor consideration in all of the other aspects, including the manufacturing. But if you do what's just been mooted, that you repurpose drugs that are over-the-counter available, and you try to compare results together from a legal perspective, and that depends on the jurisdiction you do it in, you just have to be a little bit careful that if you are the person organizing it, you are not putting yourselves out as liable for any adverse events, except in a framework that is controlled, hopefully maybe insurance controlled, but also with robust consent frameworks. I am happy to explain details, but I think that would go on.
Yeah, it's been a lot of talk about how to bypass clinical trials and also make them cheaper. But I was wondering if you could address medical reversal which is a big issue in the medical community, where drugs or treatments are approved and later they are abandoned because later trials show that the drugs don't work. And I think there was a publication in the in Lancet for like 2 years ago where like 60% of all articles were later discovered to not be true. And I mean, if you have this like very high intensity drug development, you're running the risk of approving drugs that don't work, right?
That's I think what Dr. Fullen said as well. Trials are tricky not just because they're expensive and onerous, but because they fail all the time. And they don't fail because they're expensive and onerous, they fail because they fail to demonstrate efficacy. And when we saw those surrogate endpoints in cancer, we did see that, you know, between 2005 and 2012, 60% of the drugs that were approved on surrogate endpoints had no efficacy or were damaging to the patients, and on average they cost about, I think it was $12,000 per year, which is a good price for something that just isn't effective at all. So when we in the aging field look for surrogate endpoints, we have to be really careful, because one bubble in the stock market where a few companies go under, we can survive. But one high-profile anti-aging drug that is premature can really damage the whole field for a decade.
So yes, indeed, the pharmaceutical industry has, so I will have perhaps different views, but the pharmaceutical industry has about 30 years ago removed its own research departments. They still do research, but much less than before. And they have decided to rely on universities and to buy the results. But the researchers, they want to publish, they want money to do their experiments. They don't necessarily have the same alignment as pharma. And so as a result, after some time, they have moved towards startups, which is now the current way to go. And the startups, they want to sell their things, right? And so pharma, it's always very difficult to reproduce an experiment. Everything needs to be the same. The machines, it's difficult to know whether it really works or not. And as a result, when it enters pharma, you don't really know. And when you are in the pharma, I know people in pharma a lot, it's a big industry and you're happy to have a team to be on a project. So if you start to see things that go wrong, it takes you a lot of time to decide that really it's wrong, and perhaps you change jobs before. So you see, it takes a long time to stop.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I give you 20 seconds or not.
Yeah,
a bit more, and then it will be Marta, and then Daria, and then it will be.
Because in aging research, you want to treat healthy people, and that's a specifically a big hurdle. And even if you are then going for natural compounds and you want to have an effect, it's also likely that you will have side effects. So it's a trade-off. And I guess if there's lots of trials where, no, not trials, just initiatives where volunteers are now testing some of those molecules, on the one hand, there's a risk, but on the other hand, if they do it right, if they generate data, it's of course also useful to find out about any efficacy without much side effects. And hopefully then you have also biomarkers in the end for distinguishing those who will have an effect from those who will have a side effect.
What do you think about using orphan diseases as a possible intervention? So there's, for example, these premature aging diseases that I am completely unbiased supporter of course. But we know, for example, with Hodgson Gilbert's progeria, they published a trial with a farnesylation inhibitor that seems to be efficacious. So that may limit sort of costs. But what do you think?
So slicing and dicing your disease indication into the minimum, especially with more personalized medicine, is definitely the way to go, and we see UTIs and orphan diseases for that. I would be very careful about progeria, because for all we've studied it, we know progeria is very different from aging. What I would say though, and what Edouard said incidentally, is if you have a drug that, I don't know, you want to apply in Alzheimer's, the example you mentioned, and you could orphan disease that into a very specific Lewy body Alzheimer with specific subgenotype or whatever. Do the other tests as well. Do the maybe not beta-gal, but the the general aging parameter tests. Because if you then want to off-label the thing you have put into your orphan disease niche, that's the way to go. So you can demonstrate to our community this drug is effective across the board, or potentially effective across the board in aging biomarkers. And if you fail to do that while you were driving to your market with as few steps as possible, then you just won't have the evidence.
One idea of mine, so maybe it's interesting to share, is that it's one way to go is to go for a disease, Alzheimer's for example, and to demonstrate in mice that it extends the lifespan. It will not convince everyone, of course, but it will be a good signal that you are not just targeting Alzheimer's. And it will help the drug being sold and further research being done.
Yeah, so, sorry for being a little bit patriotic, but for practical purpose, what do you think of the idea of using more post-Soviet countries? Because legislation is now harmonized. The time when clinical trials were bad are gone. We do have really good CROs and FDA-recognized sites. Everything is very cheap, especially after troubles. Maybe quite a respectable, reputable CRO says that you could have full cycle of clinical trials for $1 million or euros. And if it's very complex technology, like what Liz Parrish did, would be 10 million euros or dollars. And then the results could be really submitted to European medical agencies. So it feels to me sometimes less expensive than some animal experiments. I don't know, maybe the situation in Ukraine maybe just like that, but in Russia I can be sure that it's like that.
So since the early 2000s, that's been a prospect, clinical trials being so much cheaper in, as you said, post-Soviet countries, and lots of people have tried their hand, and some of them have got good results and some of them got burned. It's not proven universally less costly. That's for a variety of structural reasons that have to do with the etiology of the disease and the specialism of the centers that people have used. So if you have a good local connection with a clinician or an initiative of lots of people wanting to try their anti-aging treatment, then that could be the way to go. But so far the experience has been mixed about whether there are countries in the previous Eastern Bloc, if I can say that are just dramatically cheaper.
Okay, thank you to all of you.